Have you ever played a game that doesn't show you its lore, but shows you clues that can be fitted together like a jigsaw puzzle, only for the result to be still not clear? Well, that's not the case of Terraria, but it was at some point, and I wish that it still were. On May 16th of 2019, the Terraria developers released pages of an official game lore, and they even tried to make ancient parchments with some cool drawings here and there. I remember when I discovered that, I got excited, I went ahead to read it, and instead of being like, oh, now everything makes sense, I was like, Now you might be thinking that all I'm gonna do in this video is roast the lore, but what I'm going to do is criticize it, show you the plot holes that it has, and roast the lore. Because it was already time for someone to do it, like, it's been almost 5 years since they first revealed it, and not a single time I have seen someone being critical about it. It seems like they did some kind of curse to prevent people from doing that, so let's begin. Okay, so first of all, if every world in the Terraria universe is a sentient being, then each one of them is a psychopath, because in order to bring balance, they had to create biomes that spread uncontrollably, replacing the original fauna and flora, literally destroying entire ecosystems. I don't know you, but I would say that's literally the opposite of balance. If you don't believe it, look at this part talking about the corruption. Now I ask you to read the first phrase. The corruption is a cancer caused by the sins of those living in the worlds of Terraria. If the corruption is a defense mechanism used by the worlds of Terraria because each one of them is a sentient being, and at the same time the corruption is a cancer caused by the sins of those living in Terraria, does that mean that these worlds willingly cause cancer in themselves, or these worlds don't have control over the faults of those living on them? If that were the case, then how is the corruption a defense mechanism if these worlds don't have control over people's faults? Like, nothing of that makes sense. Also, let's analyze the part talking about the hollow. I'm going to ignore the crimson because it doesn't add that much to the lore. Okay, so what I understood is, the hollow is an overcompensation of purity to help in the resisting of the corruption the crimson. And that makes sense, because an evil biome can't spread to a hollowed area. But there's something wrong here. It says that it cures traits that violate the balance of life. What violates the balance of life? Exactly, the corruption and crimson. The question is, if you play Terraria, you have noticed that the hollow doesn't try to destroy any of the evil biomes. The maximum that it does is spread into evil grass, but nothing more. So while it is true that it helps resisting them, it does nothing to destroy the corruption of the crimson, so that statement is not accurate, unless if it treats the balance of life or something else. But even if that's the case, why don't the evil biomes fall under that? Now let's go already to the part which I consider to be the cherry of the cake, which is the terrible Great Lore of Cthulhu. By terrible I mean how bad it is. Let's take a look at it. Okay, you might be seeing this and be like, but there is nothing wrong here, and I tell you, there is a lot wrong here. First, let's go back to the second paragraph of the lore's first page, more specifically, the final part of it. Each world of Terraria is a sentient being that knows all that goes on and can feel the thoughts of all living creatures, with their sole purpose being to ensure that the desired balance is maintained, often violently so. The worlds utilize many defense mechanisms to ensure the balance is upheld at all costs. Some of them are known as the Hollow, Corruption, and Crimson. So what do we have here? The worlds in Terraria have defenses, and these defenses are completely useless, not only because these defense mechanisms sabotage the worlds themselves, but also because when a gigantic creature that threatens the own existence of these worlds comes by, they are all like, this is fine, unless if the Dreads are also one of their defense mechanisms, because the lore says that the Corruption, Crimson, and Hollow are just some of them. Now, before we move on, pay attention to these parts. Ripping out Cthulhu's eyes, part of its skeleton, and chunks of its brain. and forced Cthulhu to retreat to the dark side of the moon. Why did I ask you this? You are going to understand, but first, let's take a look at the next part. Alright, now that we have read that part, I can finally address what I was so anxious to address. So what do we have here? The Dryads managed to defeat Cthulhu by ripping out its eyes, parts of its skeleton and chunks of its brain, and then Cthulhu proceeded to retreat to the dark side of the moon.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
Long after that, the lunatic cultist kidnapped the mechanic and forced her to rebuild these parts.
Today's subject is slavery.
Don't you see something wrong here? I mean, seriously, don't you see something wrong here? It's been almost 5 years since this lore first dropped, and no one ever talked about this. If you don't see what's wrong here, I'm going to show you right now. The mechanical parts meant to rebuild Cthulhu that they are talking about here are obviously the mechanical bosses. The mechanical bosses are harder counterparts of pre-hard mode bosses. The twins are a counterpart to the Eye of Cthulhu, the Destroyer is a counterpart to the Eater of Worlds, and Skeleton Prime is a counterpart to the Skeletron, with the only boss without a mechanical counterpart, being the Brain of Cthulhu, and all the other bosses, but that doesn't matter. Like, there's just so much wrong here that I can't take it. First, let's compare the size of each pre-hard mode boss that is said to be a part of Cthulhu's body with each other. We put the skeleton first, then we put the Brain of Cthulhu above it, then we put an Eye of Cthulhu next to each side of Skeletron. Eater of Worlds is left out because it's not a Cthulhu organ, which is weird because at the same time that the Destroyer is its hard mode counterpart, the Eater of Worlds itself isn't a Cthulhu organ. Isn't that too convenient? So, what can we observe from that? The brain is just way too big to fit on the brain case. Actually, it's several times bigger than the entire skull. Not only that, but the lore says that the Dryads ripped chunks of Cthulhu's brain, and if you look at the Brain of Cthulhu, you can pretty much see that it's not just chunks of a brain, but a hell as of a whole brain. And if the Brain of Cthulhu is indeed just a chunk of Cthulhu's brain, then it still proves my point of the brain not fitting inside of a skull that small. What about the eyes? Just like the brain, they are bigger than the skull itself. There is absolutely no chance that the eyes would fit inside of these items. I probably don't even need to talk about the arms, right? I guess that Cthulhu has Phocomelia. Speaking of arms, we know of course that these ones belong to Skeletron, who is basically a giant floating skull. Would you like to know who else is a giant floating skull? You guessed it right, the Dungeon Guardian, which just happens to look exactly like Skeletron. What is interesting to note is, when you descend the dungeon deep enough before defeating Skeletron, it's not just one Dungeon Guardian that may spawn. There are times where multiple Dungeon Guardians spawn. Not only that, but you can also descend the dungeon while you are fighting Skeletron, which will cause you to face both Skeletron and Dungeon Guardian, sometimes more than one Dungeon Guardian. Now here comes the question. Do you think that Cthulhu had multiple heads? I don't think so, because as far as I know, the original Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft didn't. By the way, I know that Cthulhu is an eldritch abomination and all, but how did it not die from having its whole skull ripped from its head? Or skulls, if you mind. Now let's talk about two of the mechanical bosses, the Destroyer and Skeletron Prime. The twins are not relevant because the points we could address about them have already been addressed with Eye of Cthulhu. So, Skeletron Prime. Why does it have 4 arms if Skeletron has just 2 arms? Did Cthulhu have 4 arms? If that's the case, then why doesn't Skeletron have 4 arms as well? Oh, but the extra arms could be legs. Fine, I guess then my theory about Cthulhu having Phocomelia might be true after all. Also, if these were the legs, how would Cthulhu be able to stand? Think about it. Would you be able to stand if instead of feet you had a chainsaw and a... I don't know what this thing is. Besides, I don't think Cthulhu actually had legs, and you will discover why soon. But before that, Destroyer. Its bestiary entry says that it is a mechanical simulacrum of Cthulhu's spine. Did I even tell you that the Destroyer has 82 segments, and I'm not even considering for the Worthy Seeds, where it has 164 segments? I mean, the amount of segments, aka vertebrae, is not even a problem. Take the elephant as an example. It's certainly way smaller than Cthulhu, and it has from 60 to 70 vertebrae. The issue here is that the Destroyer is absurdly long. Let's take a look at how it would look. First we put Skeletron Prime, then we take the twins and put each one on each side. Now we put Destroyer below Skeletron Prime, and since there is not a picture of Destroyer with all of its 82 segments, I will need to manually place each one of them. That's a hell of a spine, huh? And I didn't even need to do that. You can just go to the Get Fixed by Siri and spawn the Medusa. Not only will you get what I just described, but you'll also get a really nice pair of probes. Besides, if you fought this boss at least once, or you saw pictures of it, you might have realized how weird and disproportional it looks. So why would it be different for Cthulhu? Don't you realize it? Next thing we should talk about is the Moon Lord. The lore says that after Cthulhu was defeated, it retreated to the dark side of the moon. And guess who comes from the moon? Exactly, the Moon Lord, which just so happens to have an appearance match that of Cthulhu. But that's not enough to claim that Moon Lord is Cthulhu. Alright, guess who the lore says that was trying to bring Cthulhu back? Exactly. The lunatic cultist, which when defeated summons the celestial pillars, which when defeated summons the Moon Lord. At this point, you should have already put the pieces together. How big are Skeletron's skull and arms compared to Moon Lord? How big is the Destroyer compared to Moon Lord's torso? How many eyes is the Moon Lord missing? How many brain chunks is the Moon Lord missing? Which bones is the Moon Lord missing? I'm going to answer all of that. Skeletron is a fetus next to Moon Lord, and its skull is human-shaped rather than something that fits. The Destroyer, with its 82 segments, is way bigger than Moon Lord itself. Do you think that an elephant's spine, with its 60 to 70 vertebrae, is bigger than the elephant itself? All of the Moon Lord's eyes are there. They only become absent when you give enough damage to Moon Lord. The brain has the same size of the brain of Cthulhu, and is not missing any chunks. Lastly, the only bones that Moon Lord is missing are two below its torso. Basically, the only thing that Moon Lord is missing are its legs. Where are the mechanical legs, Weird Logic? I want to know it right now. Actually, forget about that. Remember what I said earlier about Cthulhu's legs? Well, considering that Moon Lord is lore-wise Cthulhu, and there is an item found in Drunk World chests called Moon Lord Legs, which depicts a bunch of tentacles, we can assume that Cthulhu in the Terraria universe has tentacles for legs. Therefore, Skeletron Prime's extra arms are not legs, but there is no way they could serve as legs anyway.
Or is it?
Oh, I almost forgot about that. When you defeat any of the Moon Lord's laser shooting eyes, an enemy called True Eye of Cthulhu spawns. If that's the True Eye of Cthulhu, then what about the boss called Eye of Cthulhu? Is it not actually Cthulhu's eye? Then why does its bestiary entry say otherwise? By the way, isn't that way too convenient that the True Eye of Cthulhu doesn't have a bestiary entry? But alright. Let's disconsider Moon Lord as being Cthulhu. This is what Cthulhu looks like according to the lore.
What the heck is this thing?
It has multiple heads, all of them absurdly small, which usually would result in proportional eyes and brain, but as you can see, the brain, massive in size because the boss brain of Cthulhu is just a chunk of it, is completely outside, only being protected by a thin layer of skin. The eyes, likewise, are also massive, and they are only present on the middle head, with the other heads being completely eyeless. Because the eyes are bigger than the head itself, they are located outside of the eye sockets, and they are constantly bloodshot because there's no eyelids protecting them. Not because they are absent, but because the eyelids are too small. The 4 arms that Cthulhu has are the only thing proportional to the head size, but likewise they are disproportionately small to the rest of the body, including when compared to the torso of which is long, really long, with a spine of the same size as the destroyer. Lastly, the legs. They are just tentacles. Now, let's move on to the final bits of lore we have. Alright, so the lore implies that the mechanic was still building the brain when we find her in the dungeon. She is certainly the best worker out there because she was building the brain while completely tied up with the risk of being murdered by the dungeon enemies out of nowhere without a proper and safe place to build the mechanical bosses, because the dungeon has spikes everywhere and none of the rooms could accommodate something big as the destroyer. She was also able to build the mechanical bosses without leaving any traces of her work behind. I mean, if she was still building the brain, then where is it? You enter the dungeon and you can't find it anywhere. Also, let me ask you something. When you're stuck somewhere underground and you're forced to work to revive an eldritch entity, would you be quiet about it, or would you tell people about it once you get out of there? Because the mechanic never mentions what happened to her in the dungeon. All that she does is making reference about the Clothier kidnapping her and the fact that she was in the dungeon before. She never mentions the lunatic cultist, she never mentions Cthulhu, she doesn't even mention being forced to work there. You're fighting a mechanical boss and you interact with her. She talks about something different. You're fighting the lunatic cultist and you interact with her. She talks about something different. You can test it if you want, but there's no need to. Just go to the wiki and check all of her possible quotes. The Clothier, aka the old man that appears in front of the dungeon before defeating Skeleton. Details such as he never mentioned in the cult can be forgiven because he was afflicted by a curse after all, but there's a lot of other details that can't be forgiven, such as the fact that he's possessed by Cthulhu's bones. I mean, is that serious? Let's reflect about it. Before the official lore for Terraria was released, what did you think that Skeleton was? You probably thought that it was some kind of evil spirit that possessed the Clothier, right? Like, this is even said on his bestiary entry. It said at night he transforms into a horrific demon which guards the dungeon. Plus, killing him while having a Clothier voodoo doll summons Skeleton, as if he were or became Skeleton himself. Does that mean that the Clothier becomes Cthulhu's bones? Is the Clothier Cthulhu? I guess you see how ridiculous it is now. Lastly, the dungeon being a city where you need to jump in order to move from place to place. A city full of traps. If it was a city, then why is it called dungeon and not ruined city? Like, do you even know what dungeon means? A dungeon is, according to the Google, a strong underground prison, especially in a castle, or, according to Merriam-Webster, a dark, usually underground prison, or, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, an underground prison, especially in a castle, or, according to the Collins Dictionary, a dark underground prison in a castle. Also, why build a city underground if you can build it on the surface? Can you imagine how hot it is underground? There is no fresh air for you to breathe or to cool your body. Carbon accumulates easily because there is nowhere for it to go, and there is lots of dust in the air because it's underground. That's literally the worst kind of place for someone to live, but definitely a good place to send criminals to, because simply existing there would be a torture. If such a place at least were in the underground jungle, the oxygen would be renewed. Good for the lizards. Alright, so that was the video. I hope that you like it, and I also hope that nothing of what I said in this video sounded like offense or something, because my intention was only to criticize the lore and show you the points that I think should have been already addressed long ago. And I honestly find it really weird that no one ever talked about the lore in a critical way. They would just talk about it and say how interesting it is, how cool it is, almost like if they were robots. Honestly, I wish that this lore was no longer official and that every reference to it were removed, because a game so awesome like Terraria doesn't deserve this trash of lore. So anyway, goodbye.
Acorda, caralho! Acorda!